I think the challenge and the opportunity for corporates, for marketers, I'm not bringing a sledgehammer to the system because I'm part of it. But I think the challenge is how do you remain true to the stuff that really matters? Find the efficiencies, find the opportunities to, squeeze something out of the system, but never, ever, ever corrupt what's at the core of what connects with consumers, with people, and make sure that you're able to keep that fresh, those first principles fresh as you're connecting with people. Because you kind of get lost, People go, oh, the reason we were successful is XYZ because we did this thing. No, what was the first principle behind it? What was the thing that really connected with people and refreshed that for a new generation?
I'm Eric Fulweiler, and this is Scratch, bringing you marketing lessons from the leading brands and brains rewriting the rulebook from scratch for the world of today. Hey everyone, a very special episode for you today. We have Charl Bassil. He is the Chief Brand Officer of the BBC. Yes, that BBC. It's amazing to have Charl on the show to talk about how he has come into this newly created role of Chief Brand Officer at one of the most well-known, most loved, biggest brands, certainly in the UK, but I think you could easily argue the world as well, and how he is trying to specifically take a challenger mindset and approach to reinventing the BBC brand. It was amazing. So he's been there for 7 months now. He talks us through kind of some of his early observations, but also the specific playbook and the pillars that he is using to come in and take on this massive challenge, but also this massive opportunity. I also love hearing about his background. He originally didn't start in marketing. He started in engineering, and he got some advice very early on from a boss and a mentor about how to think about marketing in a way that really clicked for him. This idea of marketing as farming, investing, planting the seeds, growing, nurturing. And it's amazing to hear how that applied to his time throughout his whole career. SAB Miller, Pernod Ricard, Absolute that he led globally. He's built and led some of the biggest brands in the world. And now he's taken on this very big challenge, but very exciting challenge at the BBC. Such a good episode. I'm going to listen to this one a couple times over. That is for sure. I know you're going to enjoy it. Without further ado, I'll let you get on to my conversation with Charl Bassil of the BBC. Charl, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. How are things in Surrey today?
Hey, how's it, Eric? Surrey is actually sunny, believe it or not, which is quite unusual. I'm starting to get used to the rain, but it's sunny, it's pleasant. The oak trees are smiling.
Amazing. Well, wait 15 minutes and I'm sure you'll get some
Yeah,
rain. And
exactly.
also I love the traditional South African accent, the how's it, throwing it in there right from the beginning. Appreciate that. All right, Charles. So before we get into talking about everything that you're doing as the Chief Brand Officer of the BBC, can you please tell us about a challenger brand that you are particularly passionate about right now and why?
Geez, there's a whole lot of them actually, and maybe to the preamble to that is I'm a huge fan of Challenger anything, and I think that sort of fighting for your space, pushing to kind of be heard, to be known, I think is really great. There's a brand here in the UK that's probably not known, and this could be a plug for them, but it's not intended that way. It's a brand of pretzels and olives called Ollie's, and it's a little brand started by a young man who's the son of someone that I know, and he's just doing a really good job of getting his product into the right channels, including airlines. I was nibbling on some Ollie's olives, which sounds quite naughty, but I think it was on British Airways or Scandinavian Airlines quite recently. And the branding is bold. It's all about Ollie and the personality behind it. And I was actually quite taken by him and by what he's doing. I don't know him personally, but I quite like the audacity of coming into a snacks category that's just totally overwhelmed by all the big guys and really make kind of creating space for themselves and the brand. Love it.
Amazing. We'll have to
Yeah.
check it out. I mean, it's a fascinating category with everything that's going on, not just
Yeah.
the barriers to entry and distribution coming down, but also all the cultural change around snacking and eating and health and all that. I actually had some conversations recently with one of the big CPG conglomerates with their kind of, they call it the snacks future division, which I love. So basically
Brilliant.
kind of
Yeah.
the venture arm of what they do.
Yeah.
And then we actually work with a client that's more of a kind of a mid-market CPG business that's actually been pretty successful at growing through acquiring some of these challenger snack food brands as they come up. So we'll definitely have to check out Ollie's. And yeah, the distribution game is such a huge part of that
All
playbook.
about,
So
yeah,
kudos to them
100%.
for
It's
getting it right.
interesting, the example you just gave about buying and growing through acquisition. It's actually really an interesting model. You don't have to be first to market, but if you identify the brands or products that you think are going to go somewhere, you've seen some traction, and you simply bring them into sort of a system where the back end is pretty efficient is also. And I think the only thing there is that I think the trick is always going to be to allow the founder or the brand custodian
100%.
to continue being authentic and real, because that's the important part of connecting with customers and consumers is
Yeah.
that authentic part of the brand. And so, give them the platform, make the money, but allow them to be real and true and offer that value to the consumer. Yeah.
Could not agree more. And I
Yeah.
love that we're getting off track before we've even finished the first
Sorry.
question of the brief, but also we really connected because right before we press record, you were like, you know what? I don't really prep. I read the questions, but I like to be able to respond authentically.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's exactly how I do it. So I knew this was going to happen. I didn't think it'd be the first question, but I knew it would happen eventually. No, but let's keep following this because I think it's super interesting. One, the episode that just released of Scratch, so we're recording this October 11th, just released, was with a guy named Ben who started a business called Box Raw. Don't know if you've come across them. I know you recently relocated back to the UK, so probably not. But basically they make kind of boxing, but really more lifestyle apparel around boxing. And it was a fascinating conversation. Typically we have CMOs, chief brand officers, maybe marketing oriented founders on the show.
Yeah.
And this guy, doesn't come from a marketing background at all. But the biggest takeaway for me, even now, thinking about it 3 weeks after we did the recording, 4 weeks after we did the recording, is I don't think I have talked to anybody, CMO of PepsiCo, CMO of MasterCard, chief brand officer of the BBC, although let's see how this interview goes, who has been as authentic as Ben about the brand. And that's something I think I said in the recording. You can't fake that. You can't, no amount of budget, no amount of scale can create the type of authenticity that a lot of these founders have. And having spent a lot of time in corporate venture, corporate innovation, it's so, like most things, it's so simple, but that doesn't make it easy. It's hard to do right, but the answer is not complex. You buy these businesses because they are doing something different, or you start these businesses because you want them to do it differently. And yet so many businesses, when they acquire them or when they start these startups, then they suck them back into the mothership and the machine and the operations, and it kills the exact thing that you actually want to buy. So I'd love to get your reactions to that. And then also knowing that your previous role was at Absolute, I'm sure there was some, venture and acquisition or startups in that world as well. So anything you can share from that perspective would be fascinating as well.
Yeah, well, firstly to say, I think I get goosebumps when I hear people talking about authentic connection and the real desire to add value to the people's lives. I mean, people give you their money and they give you their attention and they give you their time. Like the least you can do is to give them something that's worth their while. I think that's the fundamental part of business. And it kind of gets corrupted a little bit with theory and with. I have this thing that I have a slide that the yin and the yang symbol with the the two sides.
Yep.
I'm not sort of a deep follower of Taoism but there's something really interesting about balance. And the world we're living in right now, in the world of marketing and brand building, is so driven by efficiency and so driven by kind of click through rates and reach and digital transformation. I mean, it's the same kind of AI. It's going to revolutionize it, but the sort of other side is the fundamental part of kind of why the business came into being is the effective part. Like, are you really creating and producing something and connecting emotionally in a human way with people in a way that no one else can, to get them to really part either with their money or their attention, whatever it might be. And I think in the machine, you kind of get a little bit lost from the first principles. I studied engineering before I fortunately escaped into the world of marketing. But there was something about, you get taught the algorithm in engineering, but you actually get taught never to use it. You have to go back to first principles and understand kind of what are the basics of physics or maths, and then build the algorithm from there. And I think that's true for business. What are the first principles? And that's the beauty of talking with somebody like this guy from Box Raw. I imagine, because he has the founder who's built this thing on first principles, not on theory, not on algorithm. And that's what makes it so successful. I think the challenge and the opportunity for corporates, for marketers, I'm not bringing a sledgehammer to the system because I'm part of it. But I think the challenge is, how do you remain true to the stuff that really matters? Find the efficiencies, find the opportunities to, squeeze something out of the system, but never, ever, ever corrupt what's at the core of what connects with consumers, with people, and make sure that you're able to keep that fresh, those first principles fresh as you're connecting with people. Because you kind of get lost, People go, oh, the reason we were successful is XYZ because we did this thing. No, what was the first principle behind it? What was the thing that really connected with people, and refresh that for a new generation? Anyway, before I get carried away on my next tangent.
No, I totally agree. And actually, yeah, I don't know, maybe this is something that we should do more regularly on the podcast, but asking people's definition of challenger brands, because I think the connotation is that it's a startup, that it's a disruptor. But to me and to us, the definition is brands and marketers that are using marketing that's fit for purpose for the world of today. The first principles from scratch. That's why the podcast is called what it is. So you're not approaching things with the legacy of how stuff used to be done.
Yeah.
You only think about how things should be done right now. So I think that, I could talk for a long time about the corporate venture thing, and
but it's true. It's true for the BBC, by the way. It's true for big iconic institutions that want to remain relevant to their audience today. They have to take.
Yeah.
This is what you're hearing in businesses that are forward thinking. Is they're saying we want to be the challenger. We know we're not the leader. We know that we used to be, and that was a comfortable place to be. But the discomfort of kind of losing, it's often prompted by something. There's a fire has to be burning somewhere. But sort of changing the mindset within an organization, I think, is the harder part. Leadership, people knowing that they need to change and transform and be the challenger in that particular. The BBC wants to be a challenger brand, but organizational memory is the thing that you need to kind of stretch. You need to push into the future.
100%. Well, I think that's a great segue to kind of get the train back on the track. And clearly, even in just what we've talked about in these first few minutes, it's obvious why they brought you in to have this role. So typically we ask, can you give us an overview of your brand and business for people who might not know? But I mean, the unaided, or at least the aided awareness of the BBC in the UK must be 100%, right? Or something close to that. So let's assume most people know what the BBC is. I think the more interesting thing is, can you talk to us a little bit about where the BBC is at in its journey, and specifically double click on the brand and this role of chief brand officer and what you're coming into and what you're being tasked with changing?
Okay, look, as you say, the BBC is well known and it's a well cherished brand. It's not that it's a brand that's not loved. It is loved by generations of Brits and those that live beyond the UK, because it's been such a key part of people's lives from when they were young. The acknowledgement is that its first principles have always been this notion of creating a better place, of giving people value beyond a commercial transaction, like actually being in service of the public. This idea of public service, if you really get down to what that means, is being in service of the public. It's a beautiful thing, actually. Lord Reith, who was the first chairman of the BBC, he was in an era just after the First World War, and he himself had a massive scar that he had received from a bayonet in the First World War, and I think he had sort of returned to the UK a little despondent about humanity and really wanting to give people hope for the future by creating through the medium of broadcast, which was the high tech, innovative. It was the Silicon Valley of 1922. You got to think about those first principles. It was all new. The hardware was new, the technology was new, the process was new, but putting that in the service of the public rather than for commercial gain, I think, is the fundamental differentiator of the BBC. And it's the reason why people love the brand. Now, you fast forward to 2024, a little over 102 years later, the principles are exactly the same, but the environment is different. People are accessing the media, in every which way possible, whether it's through streaming or whether it's through platforms like YouTube or TikTok. I mean, you think about the generation that's now emerging in terms of their media consumption. So it's the first principles around what the BBC wants to do remain true to the very core of being in the service of the public. But how we do that is the fundamental change. Keeping our relevance, I think, is a really important part of what the BBC's challenge and desire and will is. And when you think about the team of people that have brought me in, from the director general to the chief customer officer, I mean, Tim and Keris, when they spoke to me, the way they spoke to me in my interview was, "Do you really want to spend the rest of your life selling vodka, or do you want to make the world a better place and ensure that democracy and free speech are protected?" I was like, okay, that sounds like a good reason to join. There's something in the purpose of what the BBC stands for that makes it very compelling. But yes, the challenge is remaining relevant and being sure that people perceive the value that they are getting, because I think sometimes people do take it for granted. And there's a lot of complaint about, why people are paying a license fee when they're using other things like streaming. The truth is the BBC is streaming. By the way, the BBC was the first streaming service in the UK with iPlayer. I think they should have made more of it at the time. But it is now the fastest growing video on demand service in the UK. So there's stuff about the BBC that people might not even know, because we sort of default to what was known. And that opportunity also exists, is going beyond the stuff that we presume people know, is that we actually need to kind of remind them and actually reach a whole new generation who might not even see us as relevant or might not even know us that well, to be honest.
And how long have you been in the role now?
I've been in the role since the 1st of March. So what's that, 7 months? Feels
Okay.
like 7 years.
So how do you, this massive challenge and opportunity to reinvent a well-known, well-loved, but legacy brand, to adopt that challenger mindset, to drive relevance, where do you start? I'm assuming kind of the first few months was, getting up to speed. It's a big organization. It's a massive brand. Yeah. There's so many bits and pieces to it. But now you're 7 months in. I'm guessing there's kind of a bit of a roadmap or a playbook that you're starting to apply.
Yeah.
So, what are the things, what are the strategic pillars of your plan to reinvent the BBC?
Look, I think I feel like I'm just the noob learning from such incredible people around me that know the industry, that know the business way more than I can ever imagine to even get to in a couple of years, to be honest. So I think the first acknowledgement is you don't have to. In fact, one of my mentors at South African breweries, Norman Adamy, said to me, "If you're the smartest guy in the room, you're in the wrong room." And I know it's one of those things that people speak about now, but I remember hearing it for the first time when I was 27, 28. And it's really struck me as the fundamental thing with anything you start doing or anything you do at any point. That's how I feel. I feel like I'm surrounded by really smart people who know the industry, who know how to connect with audiences, who know how to produce content. So, I'm not coming in with any sense of entitlement or I know better. It's more, I think, having a naivety, having an energy and enthusiasm for what they're doing, being excited about it, and shining a spotlight on the stuff that the BBC is doing, but maybe not shouting about, because they feel, well, that's the value that we're adding to the public. Why should we shouldn't talk about it. It feels like we're boasting or bragging. I'm like, well, let the South African in the room boast on your behalf. There's something to being the outsider in the room that gives you permission to kind of shine a spotlight on the great stuff that people are doing without them feeling awkward about it. So that's the sort of fundamental feeling about where I am. In terms of the kind of the way forward, I mean, it's tough. It's not rocket science. Marketing is, I wish I could claim it to be rocket science, but it's really coming back to your very first point about the founder and the first principles. It's really just getting back to what are the basics. And the first thing is, what's our true north? What's the thing that we stand for? What's the thing that we stand for that we're telling people in a very succinct, what's the elevator pitch of this institution? Because we are trying to be all things to all people, but what's the elevator pitch? So having a vision is super, super important. That true north, that would be the first thing. And we've articulated that, and the people that are around me and that have come before me have actually articulated that really well. So, taking that in, refining it, and putting it back out to audiences in a way that's clear and succinct and single-minded, I think is super important. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you are what you measure. I know this, I said earlier on about effectiveness and efficiency. So what are the measures that we need to put into place to measure the success of the BBC brand, but also the sub brands within there, the content brands, the platform brands, from iPlayer to the radio services, through to brands like Doctor Who and Strictly Come Dancing. There's some incredible brands that are, within this incredible mother brand. And I mean, it comes down to this idea that we've been pushing through digital transformation, and they're doing a really good job of digital transformation at the BBC. We've been pushing usage, so getting people onto digital platforms. What I'm really driving at the moment is this idea of brand equity measures. How do you measure brand performance and brand power? Through things like salience, distinctiveness, and value. And then using that to build a portfolio, again, keeping it simple. What does the view of the BBC portfolio look like? I'm talking about content brands and how successful they are, so that we can start talking about brand performance when we're thinking about the next steps in building the BBC. And then finally, I would say there's a map around what competence, capabilities we have within the organization to deliver against that, and identifying where those gaps are. So the people side, and then making sure that people are speaking the same language and orientated in the same direction. So true north, measures, and people. I mean, to summarize it into three spaces. But again, I think it's not going to be surprising to anyone who's done this. It's the basics.
So it's the story, how you measure the impact of that story, and then the people. I think that's very clear and logical. Hey everyone, just want to take a quick minute because we've actually heard from many of you that you want to get a better understanding of what it is that we actually do here at Rival. You know us for the content. Obviously, you're listening to Scratch right now, but everything else that we put out, the events, the community, but actually our core business, just so you know, we are a marketing consultancy for challenger brands. We partner with brands big and small to gain category share with a challenger approach. We develop and execute strategies and campaigns across four main areas of the marketing function: brand strategy, creative and production, paid media planning and buying, and customer data and MarTech. And then, of course, as you know, the mission that's wrapped around Rival is to understand and share our learnings about what drives the growth of successful challenger brands. That's it. Sorry for the interruption. I'll let you get back to the show. So I want to double back, and as the first pillar in your plan, storytelling. And it was clear to me, I even wrote it in the brief, after we had our prep call, but obviously it's clear to us and our audience at this point, you're clearly a great storyteller. Some of the things that I plucked out, quotes from you in our brief call, that I just wanted to come back to and let you unpack for us. You said, one, marketing is like farming, sustainably cultivating assets that can provide annuity over time. The other thing you said that I loved is that most people feel like they're the other. Marketing is about bringing these people in and making sure they feel heard. So I'd love for you to unpack those quotes, those perspectives, those philosophies. And if you can, maybe tie it to how you're applying them to your roadmap at the BBC.
Oh, thanks, Eric. It's always interesting to hear your words being played back to you. There's an element of I feel quite shy hearing them being played back to me. But the first one actually comes from a conversation I had with a mentor at South African Breweries, Norman Adamy, who was the CEO at the time. I was what they now call the chief of staff. Back then they called it an executive assistant. So, I'd be taking the notes in the board meetings and writing the speeches and putting together a strat presentation or whatever it might be. Freshly from Bain and Company into the brewing industry, and that was my first role. And after a year, the South African Breweries had bought Miller in Milwaukee, and Norman was on his way to Milwaukee to take over as president of Miller Brewing Company. So he said to me, so Charl, and I could get his accent because he's a legend, and he's kind of more like, Charlie, my boy. This was 2002. Charlie, my boy, where to now, my boy? Because I'm off to the States and you've got to choose where you're going to go into this organization. So, typical 28-year-old, I was trying to prove myself. And the fact that I understood the business, I said, look, we're in Norman, I want to be at the center of growth. And, growth comes either from acquisition or from organic marketing. And it's either one of those two things. And he actually said to me, look, you're right. Acquisition is about it's about growth, but it's actually hunting. You go and you kill the animal, you take it in, and you can feed the family for a week. He said the thing about marketing is that it's like farming, because you sow the seeds, you nurture the soil, you wait for the weather, and if you get it all right, if the conditions are good, you can feed the village for a year. He said, and you, Charlie, my boy, you are a nurturer, not a killer, which at 28, I really didn't like because I really wanted to be seen as the macho killer. This was, South Africa. I wanted to be the guy that was seen as, I can go and do the job. But he was absolutely right. This idea of nurturing is very true to me as an individual. My father was a farmer. I come from peasant farmers in the villages in Lebanon that go back, 1,000 years in the same village, farming the land, nurturing the soil, feeding the village. And for us, that idea of feeding people is so much part of our culture. It's like you want to take care of others. It is imbued in kind of who we are. And I feel that about brands. I really feel that our responsibility as brand custodians is to nurture these beautiful things that have been created. Because, yes, they are assets. So we can, there's a financial value to them. But more than that, they actually are feeding the farmers. Let's take Absolute as an example. Absolute Vodka, beautiful brand, but there were actually farmers farming wheat to provide the grain, for the brewing and then the distillation process. There's truck drivers, there's the retailers, the growers. So many people's livelihoods depend on us in the way that we nurture these things for the long term. And too often you have, in the world of sort of annual cycles and shareholder meetings, the growth imperative, which means people make short-term decisions to promote, to drive sales in the short term at the expense of the long term. And you end up degrading these beautiful assets over time if you don't sufficiently invest in the sustainability of those brands, in the relevance of those brands, so that it can feed future generations. To sort of extend the metaphor to the full extent. And so I really do fundamentally believe that we have a strong role and an important voice in the boardroom. Because, yes, we do have to get the annuity this year. And, yes, we've got to meet our targets. And, yes, we've got to pay the salary bills. Absolutely. But have you thought about next year? Have you thought about 5 years? Have we thought about 10 years' time? I think marketers and the custodianship of brands is a future-orientated role. And it has to be one of those roles where you keep looking up and looking to the future and determining or trying to optimize whether the decisions you're making today are sustainable and have long-term potential for growth, not just short-term annuity.
Hey everyone, just another quick interruption. If you're listening to this podcast and you're not already part of our AMP community on WhatsApp, would love for you to get involved. So AMP is a community that we started at the beginning of the business, really, just to kind of bring together some of the interesting people that we were talking to, the marketers that we were coming across, many of whom have been on this show as well. And so now AMP is about 300 senior marketers from around the world, from various categories, different stages, challengers, incumbents. And it's really a place where people can share questions, can share resources, can make new connections, can use folks as sounding boards. And for those that are in it, it is a very vibrant community. It's really taken on a life of its own, which is amazing. So if you're listening to this and you want to get involved, please go to our website, wearerival.com. There you can find the application form or reach out to me or someone at Rival directly. Thanks so much. I totally agree. And one of the things that I say is brand is long-term cash flow. I think sometimes when you're talking to non-marketers, financial, commercial, executive board, sometimes that just helps to make it click in their mind. Because it's like, it's not that it's not tied to commercial results, it's that it's
Of course.
tied to long term commercial results by definition. I'd be curious
Yeah.
on that note. It sounds like the BBC creating this role, there was already that understanding for the need around investing in the brand explicitly. And you being in a chief brand officer role, of course, from the very beginning, it is about how do you build a brand, measure the impact of the brand, et cetera. Do you have any advice from all your years of experience at these big, commercially oriented organizations with Absolute at SAB Miller, et cetera, for marketers listening that are maybe struggling to get that case over the line with their C-suite or their board that, hey, you need to invest in brand. It is about long-term cash flow. What advice would you give them about how to make that case?
This is the engineering me answering now, which is uh, rigor, data, um, pilot studies all those things are really, really important. So no, I mean, you've got to know the impact of what your business is, what you're doing within your business. Because the trap that the CFO could force you into, I haven't experienced a CFO yet, by the way, who tries to do that, but that you could be faced with is that you're seen as the cost center within the organization, and you're doing your
Yeah.
brand stuff in inverted commas, and that's all very nice. But when the tough times come, we need to buckle down and cut that. In reality, it's your responsibility. It is a responsibility, not just a privilege. It's a responsibility to keep the business balanced with the short and the long term. And making the case for this does require, there's so much data out there. There's so many really great studies. I mean, I've used the Milbert Brown Vermeer case study around creativity equals commercial success. There's work that was done around insights that drive commercial success. Credit to so many smart people that have done the work. Accessing that is not that difficult, and actually putting that in front of a commercially driven board and actually showing the correlation between, firstly, understanding your consumer or your audience through insights, delivering work that creatively connects with and emotionally triggers that consumer or audience, leading to brand equity that builds over time, ultimately delivers a much stronger commercial result over a longer and a more sustained period of time. All the data is there. So start with that. And then the second part of that is then to show that within your own plan, how are you choosing to invest the money that gets allocated to that brand investment? Make the case for it. And there's a little trick which I'm happy to share, which I think is a useful one for marketers, and I think most people do that nowadays, but in case you haven't done it, make sure you have a risks and opportunities slide at the end of your marketing plan. Like, what is the risk of not investing more in these brands? Like, what could happen if the competitor comes, or a new competitor that you weren't expecting, or and then what are the opportunities? Like, there is so many opportunities for growth that you could be driving, and that the those opportunities need to be quantified, and then there needs to be an investment that needs to be put beside them. And those risks and opportunities lead to a really healthy conversation about what the investment can do to help. And this is the word, growth. I know some organizations have even changed the title of a CMO to Chief Growth Officer. Whatever. Like, it doesn't really matter, right? As long as
Yep.
we as a business, um, as a collection of people with your own specializations, respect one another. I respect the supply chain director, the CFO. Get to understand that our job is to kind of go and find growth, to identify where the opportunities for growth are with consumers, audiences, to figure out a plan to get there, and to put the right amount of investment, not spend, investment behind getting that growth. I don't know if that's a
Yep. That's
tutorial
great.
on getting more
No,
money for marketing budget or what.
for sure. I think anybody who needs to make that case, go rewind the last 2 minutes and take some notes. So, Charl, what about this other quote of most people feel like they're the other? I thought it was a really interesting perspective about how you think about the role of marketing and brand specifically, and actually trying to make people feel like they're heard. I'd love for you to
Yeah.
unpack that a little bit as well.
No, no, this is quite, I get goosebumps on this one. It's an emotional one. I think there's two parts to this. This is me personally and kind of why I identify with this, and there's the part the research shows around Gen Z and how they feel, more broadly. So therefore, I am Gen Z. No, maybe not. Um, so growing up in South Africa as a Lebanese kid, along with Jewish, Lebanese, Italian, Greek, Indian, there was a big community of others, and we kind of coalesced around a common community. But I remember growing up always wondering kind of what my identity was and where I belonged. And that sense of being the other kind of was really what fueled me to kind of really want to be successful and prove myself and all of those things. But it was only through the words of a really smart Greek friend of mine who, um, this is now the late 90s, early 90s, when being a gay Greek man wasn't that accepted. So, and he was struggling with that part of his identity. He wrote this beautiful play, and he actually, I paraphrase him a lot because he wrote something and I'll paraphrase it. I discovered that, my identity was made of being Western in my head, British educated in a way, Lebanese in my heart, because, the long table, everyone gathered under the grapevines and having a meal, and African in my soul, that I realized what it means that being the other is actually being a collection of things. And then when I discovered through particularly the research in the alcohol industry, because we were targeting in many ways a legal drinking age consumers, 18 to 35, you're always kind of interested in what's happening in that stage of their lives. And particularly with Gen Z, you realize that sort of 70% of Gen Z consumers feel like they're an outsider. They're actually on the outside looking in. And I don't know what what that's driven by, and there's a lot of behavioral psychologists to be able to answer that much better. But this idea that the world is moving faster, fragmentation of media. I mean, part of the BBC narrative is we want people to feel like they belong. There's actually a pillar dedicating to live streaming big events where everyone can be part of that and actually have a conversation around that live event. But the reality is, beyond that, so many people are watching their content on their device. The time to really connect with one another isn't as deep perhaps as it was in previous generations. So people do feel like they're the other. What brands offer is, if they do this correctly, and is a deeper sense of value. If they really tap into kind of what it is that they stand for as a brand. I mean, Absolute as a brand, for instance, really comes from the 1980s and its collaboration with the gay community in New York, with Andy Warhol, with art, with design. And it very much at the core of the brand was this idea that everyone belongs. Doesn't matter if you're gay or straight, if you're man or a woman, if you're black or white. Like there's a place where you can mix. In the same way that a cocktail mixes society, the best parties are when people are mixing, and society is at its best when it's mixed. And one of my colleagues, Tad, actually came up with a line, "Born to Mix," which is the new tagline for Absolute. But at the very core of that is this idea that brands should endeavor to bring people in and feel like they belong to something, that they're part of something. Because when you feel like you belong, you feel like you can be at your best. You feel like you can push yourself forward and push yourself out there and start exploring your personality, exploring who you are. And so it is fundamental to both, I guess, individual or human growth, human endeavor, but it's also really important for business to understand that they need to be a place where they can attract people and they can belong. There's some really great brands that do that. I think of Apple. You belong to that community when you're using an Apple iPhone or an Apple Mac, or you're saying something to the world about yourself through that brand. And that gives you a sense of belonging when you see someone else with a MacBook. Yeah.
And I think, just for me, as you were talking about that, if you put that lens on how you think about the brands that you pull into your life, it applies to all of them. But I think that, community as kind of a buzzword is thrown around a lot right now. But I think thinking about it more explicitly of how can you reach people that feel like they're the other, as you put it, and give them something that reflects back to them the values that they have. I think that's a really interesting prompt for people to think about. So, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
We're not just about, I think fundamentally, we're not just about making money. And I mean that as society, and I mean that as individuals, and I mean that as businesses as well. We sometimes think that's what we are, but when in a couple of decades you're around on the planet and then you're gone, what are we actually contributing through the work that we do, the brands that we build, the messages that we give people that are positive, that give them a sense of belonging, that give them a sense of purpose, that give them a positive message. I really fundamentally think that we, all of us, everyone listening to this, anyone who's interested in marketing, if you keep that in mind and say, well, what positive impact am I making? Not just on the bottom line, but on the people that I work with and on my audience or my consumer. I think there's legacy in that that's much bigger than the sort of short term baton handling of brand custodianship. I think it's fundamental. I often say to people, I saw a T-shirt once that I really loved. It's a T-shirt, it's pretty glib, but I quote that T-shirt so often, which is "Be brave and be kind." That being brave in what we do is about kind of pushing the boundaries and pushing beyond all of those stakeholders and all of those moments where you think, if I say this, I'm going to look like I'm not that smart or that I don't get the finances behind this. But you've got to be brave and put it out there. And then you've got to be kind as well. You've got to be kind to your consumers. You've got to be kind to that Gen Z who's struggling. You've got to be kind to your colleagues up the hall who are doing the accounting or just waiting for your spreadsheets, and be kind to the creative team or the agency who's waiting for the brief, and they're going to be working through the night. So you just be kind. Be kind to yourself, I guess, as well.
A little more of that could go a long way,
Yeah.
that's for sure.
Yeah.
Charl, I know we only have a few minutes left. I think the last thing I'd love to get your thoughts on is you mentioned that you think the BBC needs to think and act like a challenger brand. I'd love to
Yeah.
just, open that up a little bit for conversation, because not just you coming in, this role being created, but obviously the media landscape is going through tremendous change and disruption, over the last 10 years. So what does it mean? Like, how are you thinking about turning the BBC into a challenger brand? I know you mentioned it's as much an internal thing and the mindset and culture internally, but what is that going to look like in terms of how you plan on changing how the brand comes to life and what marketing looks like for the BBC?
Yeah, I think being a challenger brand is very much an internal mindset. So you're right when you start with an internal mindset, and I have to say, what I've discovered is a group of people that are probably there, certainly at the senior leadership level. This idea that it's not a comfortable position when you have the media landscape fragmenting and exploding the way it has. But that's a good thing. Like you've got people who go, this is a good thing for us. This is really helping us accelerate our digital transformation, our focus on universal value and remaining relevant for the next generations. And I think that word relevant is probably what underpins it all. You're either relevant or you're extinct. And if you go back to what I spoke about early on, if you understand that at the very core of this brand is the desire to be in service of the public, I think there's a genuine mission, there's a genuine energy that says we can't afford to be irrelevant, because in this world of fragmented media, in this world of sort of untapped or overflowing content, who's actually taking care of the end user and the audience? Like, there's this beautiful brand within our portfolio called CBBS. It's curated content for under 6 year olds. It's an incredible brand with incredible content, which includes Bluey, Hey Dougie, Number Blocks. I have a 2 year old, so I've now discovered all of these brands. But the content is curated in a way that it's actually good for young kids. It's not just about avoiding the screen time. It's like, if you're going to give screen time, give quality screen time. Give content that's actually building, growing, has a positive message. So there is such a belief in, and I think it's a well-founded belief in being a servant of the public in a way that contributes to the audience, that it's driving the organization to have a look at itself in a very critical way and to do things that ultimately add value to its audience. And that's in the context, by the way, not just of a media industry that's fragmenting and it's exploding with content, but also I would call an unfriendly press environment in the UK. Like, there's a couple of people that have done really stupid things at the BBC, really stupid things. And the press has jumped on that and made it a BBC issue, even though the BBC's followed all the right processes, fired the people involved, there are people outside of the BBC who don't want it to be successful because, in a way, it's kind of taking up space that they could have and then generate, advertising. So let's be honest about that. And I think what I've discovered is people are so polite and so kind that they don't make a big fuss about it. They get on with it. They deal with it. But the truth is, hey, this space was earned over 102 years. It comes from a good place. Let's challenge for that for the next 100 years. And let's not allow the space to be taken up because their intent is really good. The purpose of this brand is really good. So what are the things you do? Digital transformation, focused on streaming, focused on being where the audience is rather than projecting through broadcasting, bringing in brands that are, content brands that are relevant and that are meeting the audience's desire to stay connected to, the slight edge of entertainment. We have a fantastic history of building comedians and comedy. That's an interesting place. It's very fragmented, but constantly sponsoring and developing talent within the UK. There's a whole pillar around developing homegrown talent. Actually, the BBC puts so much money back into the creative industry in the UK. That's something that needs to be spoken about as part of the brand being a challenger brand, because these things sometimes get taken for granted, and sometimes we forget to shout from the highest mountain about the wonderful things that this brand continues to do.
Well, it actually comes back to where we started the conversation, which was around authenticity. Every incumbent, no matter how big, no matter how old, at one point was a challenger. And I think nobody makes that case better than the BBC, given where it started. Yeah. So it sounds like a lot of this journey about changing the mindset internally towards being a challenger brand is actually about going back to a lot of the things that are already there, uncovering them, and making sure that people can adopt that mindset again. Yeah. So, Charl, it's been a fascinating conversation. I know we're up on time. If we could quickly do a lightning round question to close it out, just kind of, one word, quick hit answers to the following questions. So I know you didn't start in marketing, but what was the first marketing job that you ended up having?
The first marketing job was a brand development manager for mainstream brands at the South African breweries. And then the first real brand marketing job I got was as brand manager for Amstel Lager.
Amazing. What is the best piece of career advice that you've received?
Yeah, I would say it's got a lot to do with that nurturing piece on brand as a farming. The reason why it was the best, and I'm not giving you one answer, but the reason why it was such a good bit of advice was be true to yourself. And I think that's the advice. Find something that's authentic to who you are.
I was thinking that it's great advice in general, but it sounds like it was the right thing to say at the right time for you specifically as well.
And that's what makes great leaders great, by the way. They get 100%. You, they understand you. Yeah.
100%. What is the best brand campaign that you've seen recently?
The best brand campaign that I've seen recently. Oh man, so many to choose from. I really enjoyed our own Olympics campaign. I have to say that I came in, it wasn't mine, but I really enjoyed the way that the BBC was talking about the Olympics and kind of our coverage of the Olympics. It was true to Paris. It was true to the BBC, and it mixed this world of sport and love in such a I think a really creative and artistic way. I loved it.
And last question, what is one thing people should do differently after listening to this episode?
One thing they should do differently, I think just remember to be kind. Just be kind to one another, to yourself.
Love that. Charl, thank you so much for the time. It's been a great, great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise, Eric. Fantastic. Thank you, man.
Scratch is a production of Rival. We are a marketing consultancy on a mission to understand what drives the growth of successful challenger brands. Find us online at wearerival.com, LinkedIn, or visit our content hub to listen, read, and watch more of our content and research. Or just drop us a note at media@wearerival.com. We'd love to hear from you.